Juneteenth, more than a celebration rooted in Texas, it reflects America's ongoing journey toward freedom for all and remains an unavoidable part of our history.
Slavery was a dark time, but it doesn't define us as a people.
With deep roots starting here in Florida.
Emancipation Day is the celebration of our freedom.
Rich stories of tradition and pride across communities, paving the way for history to be preserved and honored.
Because if we don't tell it, nobody else will.
News4Jax is tracing the roots, the story of Juneteenth. It was on this date, June 19th, 1865, enslaved people in Galveston, Texas learned they were free. Juneteenth is a moment in American history that extends far beyond the Lone Star State.
And right here in Florida, we acknowledge not only what happened in Galveston, Texas, but the moment that slavery ended right here in Florida. For the next 30 minutes, we're tracing the roots by uncovering the untold stories that for us will inspire others for a unified future.
Slavery is an uncomfortable truth about America's history, but it happened. This announcement from a slave auction February 8, 1856 reads, "Will be sold, boys, men, and one woman." The journey to freedom came through the Civil War from 1861 to 1865. The goal was to keep the United States together. The second impact was the end of slavery. And even though the Emancipation Proclamation is widely recognized as the end of slavery, that wasn't the case for all parts of the country. Local historian Adonica Toller explains.
It did not apply to the slave states that stayed in the Union. Their enslavement was legal. So that's why I tell people Emancipation Proclamation did not end slavery in the United States.
The end of the Civil War in 1865, there were thousands of slaves in the North and millions in the South. After the war, the passage of the 13th Amendment officially abolished slavery, except as punishment for a crime.
Until the 13th Amendment was passed in December 6, 1865.
At the end of the war, news spread quickly that slavery had ended. African Americans throughout the North held meetings and church services on January 1st, 1863, to celebrate the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation.
The Emancipation Proclamation was first read officially January 1st, 1863. And what many people don't know is it actually was read on that day here in Jacksonville, St. Augustine, Key West, Florida, and Pensacola, because those cities were controlled by the Union Army.
The Emancipation Proclamation Association was formed by Duval's beloved Eartha White. This is a photo of Terrell Walker, a young boy who will reenact Abraham Lincoln's announcement of the Emancipation Proclamation at Second Baptist Church in 1980. The commemoration was sometimes an opportunity to discuss ways to improve the Black community. This photo from 1995 at Church of God Sanctuary of Praise shows William H. Randall presenting the Black Community Renaissance Plan that would revitalize I-95 and Gulf Air Boulevard. And now at Emancipation Proclamation Day, it has grown beyond the Black community and churches, and it is acknowledged by the entire community. For 162 years, a celebration of freedom has continued.
The roots of Galveston, Texas. Historical significance are deeply connected to the stories of freedom that stretch across the country, including Florida. In Florida, the end of slavery is commemorated as Emancipation Day, marking the day freedom was proclaimed in Tallahassee on May 20th, 1865, just 11 days after the Civil War ended, and 2 years after the proclamation was first issued by President Abraham Lincoln to free the slaves in southern states. Amelia Island holds a very significant place in Florida's emancipation timeline. We're here at Fort Clinch, near the shores where enslaved people first arrived.
It was a safe haven for the enslaved as the Union troops took control. And even though slavery was still dominant in places like Galveston, Texas, and Amelia Island, they got an early glimpse at freedom.
It's a story of resilience, rooted in the sand and soil of Amelia Island. Long before becoming a postcard destination was a promise of refuge for the formerly enslaved. George Green carries a lot of that history with him.
I was acquainted with the late Gabriel Means.
His great-grandfather, Gabriel Means, was one of the enslaved people who lived on what was once known as the Harrison Plantation.
He was in the military. It's rewarding to know that we had that kind of history.
It was February 11th, 1865, 3 months before Florida's emancipation, when General William Sherman sent Union soldiers to Trinity United Methodist Church to relay the message that Black enslaved families were free. But long before freedom touched this community, author and historian Marcia Feltz says the pain of slavery wasn't just physical.
What did they go through as enslaved people?
Agony, suffering. Nothing could be worse than slavery.
When the message of freedom finally came, Trinity was overflowing with nearly 300 people in their Sunday best. They lifted their voices in the doxology, praise God from whom all blessings flow.
We must and we will overcome.
These shores behind me once saw enslaved Africans brought to Amelia Island by force. But not too far from here, after emancipation, those very same people built a community based on faith, freedom, and new beginnings.
That new beginning was Franklintown, built by freed Black families who bought land with hope, driven by the promise of 40 acres and a mule, a promise that for many was never fully kept. A.L. Lewis Museum Executive Director Carol Alexander says Franklintown was built on hope.
There were maritime workers. They were on the shrimp boats. They had schools, churches.
One of those churches, the Franklintown Community Church, was established by Means and his wife Edith in the late 1800s. Green still worships in the church his ancestors built. However, by 1972, Franklintown was gone. Over the decades, developers took over the land, making way for State Road A1A and the Omni Hotel, forcing families, including the Greens, to move.
We were getting phone calls, and we're gonna move y'all church, you're gonna move this, we're gonna move that. And it just was a thing where greed and for money, they would do anything to try to get us out of here.
The historic church was relocated to nearby American Beach, and within its walls, the spirit of Franklintown still lingers. The old bell, once rung by newly freed hands, still stands on the property today. It's that legacy of faith and resilience that still echoes through the families who call this community home.
Coming up next, it's a tradition in deep-rooted history, especially here in Jacksonville.
I call it one of the high seasons in the African-American experience.
News4Jax traces the powerful night that led to freedom.
Plus, how one local activist turned discovery into action, helping others uncover the power and purpose behind Juneteenth.
As the clock nears midnight on New Year's Eve, African-American churches and African-American families won't only be gathering to celebrate bringing in a new year, they'll also be ready to celebrate a tradition rooted in freedom.
Before the church was built, was nothing but bushes. And I used to think, I said, well, how in the world could they have a church built like this?
Bush Harbor is a scenario for a type of church. This wasn't the only Bush Harbor. Yeah. Apparently they were the early churches. Yeah. The very first ones were called Bush Harbors.
The narrator on this Mount Zion AME Church video is talking about the very first African American churches made by slaves out of brush and trees, where they secretly praised and worshiped God. They weren't allowed to practice religion, but they did through songs, poems, and dance, also holding watch night services, awaiting the adoption of the Emancipation Proclamation, which would take effect on January 1st, 1863.
It was pretty much an outdoor sanctuary in the woods. And to my understanding, they would have blankets, wet blankets, I believe, blankets around in the woods to capture the sound so that the slave owners and people would not hear them. It's called hush, because they would have poems, singing and praising God and all that. So
Pastor Victor Cole of Mount Zion AME Church says on watch night, enslaved and free Black Americans watched and prayed because at midnight the proclamation became official. It declared freedom for enslaved people in Confederate states, a monumental though incomplete step towards liberation. Jacksonville native Sandra Maureen recalls attending a traditional watch night service as a child, where church members paid their respects to those who passed away that calendar year.
As a child, there was always the deacons who stood on the four corners of the church with usually black suits and white gloves, and they made it a very formal ceremony of calling the names out of the deceased from that year, moving into the next year, and it was a calling of the ancestors.
The emancipation didn't immediately reach all enslaved people, with those in Texas not hearing the news until June 19, 1865, now commemorated as Juneteenth. The tradition remains a vital bridge connecting generations to the struggle for liberation and the power of faith and community.
We could not celebrate Juneteenth openly in the city of Jacksonville, and now to be able to celebrate Juneteenth in Jacksonville in the way that we do it has been so important, because there's only been a few people that's carried the tradition of Juneteenth on, which brings it into the holiday that it is today.
Black Christians say the same spirit that carried African Americans through slavery, Jim Crow, and civil rights marches shows up every watch night, a reminder that freedom was fought for and it's still worth protecting.
Jubilee Day, Black Freedom Day, or most known as Juneteenth. It's a blend of June and 19th. The official flag was created in 1997. It's red, white, and blue, a reminder that the slaves in Texas were Americans. The star represents the Lone Star State of Texas, and the bursting outline star stands for new beginnings. Texas made Juneteenth a holiday in 1979, the first to do so. Florida followed in 1991, observing it long before most states. 30 years later, former President Joe Biden signed the Juneteenth National Independence Day Act in 2021, making it a federal holiday.
As we mark this critical day in American history, more people are calling for a deeper understanding of what Juneteenth really means. That includes ensuring younger generations keep its message alive for years to come.
As a local advocate and social justice crusader, it's safe to say Juneteenth is a day Nubian Roberts always looks forward to.
Every year, I get totally excited. Juneteenth is like my Christmas.
But as Roberts explains, it didn't exactly start out that way.
As a person who was raised in Europe, because my father was in the military, I didn't know a lot about Black history. And then to find out Juneteenth was the day that every single Black person in the South knew that they were liberated from slavery. I mean, it kind of knocked my socks off that people didn't know when it happened.
That phrase, "didn't know," is a big part of why Roberts does what she does. Her group, Black Power Rising, operates within Florida Rising, which advocates for marginalized communities. That includes information sharing.
Juneteenth is on and popping. We come from a time of the internet. Back then we didn't have it. So it's great to have information flow quickly now, but back then we didn't have that luxury.
In celebration of Juneteenth, most notably, Roberts says there will be a community event celebrating Nathan Myers. In 2019, Myers and his uncle Clifford Williams were exonerated after serving more than 40 years in prison for a crime they didn't commit.
Mr. Williams and Mr. Myers, the indictments have been dismissed against you. You are free to go.
That's probably out of all the events, the one I'm most excited about, because it's always wonderful to see someone get justice when it comes down to their freedom. He really represents what Juneteenth stands for.
That's why Roberts says sharing these stories is vital.
It's important that we as parents, no matter what our race is, we talk about Juneteenth with our children, because if we do not talk about what happened in our history, it could happen again. You know, my mom always said, if you want to keep a secret from someone, put it in a book, because most people don't read. Slavery was a dark time, but it doesn't define us as a people. So we can, you know, emerge into greatness if we just continue to support each other, and we want to continue to, you know, shame racism and fight it. And the way that we fight racism is through love, 100%.
Celebrating Juneteenth as a day of freedom, ensuring its legacy will have a lasting impact on future generations for years to come.
She's using her passion for history and an electric car to educate and inspire.
And I want them to begin to research their history. I want them to begin to research the history in their city, and I want them to share it. I don't want them to hold on to it.
How one tour guide ensures the stories of Black neighborhoods are never forgotten.
The roots of Juneteenth run deep through Jacksonville's historically Black communities, each street with its own story of resiliency.
And there is one woman preserving that history 1 mile at a time, teaching the community about the past while leading them into the present.
It's the electric car
This one is a placard of James Weldon Johnson.
and that yellow hat that give it away. If you see those two things, you have the chance to embark on educational tours that detail pertinent history.
Have a discussion.
This is Yoli Copeland, the tour guide for Explore Jack's Core. Of all the options available to anyone out there, she took us on what's called the Juneteenth Storytelling Tour.
I want them to go home, and I want them to pick up a history book, and I want them to begin to research their history. I want them to begin to research their history in their city, and I want them to share it. I don't want them to hold on to it.
First stop is the site where the very first Duval County Courthouse was ever built, Forsyth and Market Streets. Built in the early 1840s, before being burned down during the Civil War, it was rebuilt and burned down again during the Great Fire of 1901. But it's what Copeland said happened here during slavery on the steps of the courthouse. Slaves were auctioned off and sold here.
I carry things like this that talk about a slave auction. To see it, you know, people, they're just, it's a moment, it's a quiet moment.
The next stop, not too far away, is in La Villa, Adam and Davis Streets, to this historic marker, showing where Fort Hatch was built. Copeland said it was established back in May of 1863 when the Union Army occupied Jacksonville, and shortly after, Black men were legally allowed to fight in the military with the Union. Fort Hatch was a safe haven to protect servicemen and their families from Confederate troops and other enemies.
This is a pass that was issued from the U.S. Army to a Black family. Let's say you were a Black family and you run away with your family, your wife and your children, and maybe one of your parents. You know where the fort is at.
One final stop, Bay Street and Ocean Street, the spot where a Freedmen's Bank once stood. Formerly known as the Freedmen's Savings and Trust Account, a Freedmen's Bank was created shortly after the Civil War ended. Copeland says it was to help newly freed slaves manage their finances, save, and access credit. It was also a resource to help them acquire land and reunite with their families. But Copeland said the Freedmen's Bank had a short lifespan, closing for good less than 10 years later because of mismanagement, corruption, and theft. That led to Black people losing millions of dollars during the Reconstruction era. Copeland, who's from Miami and a retired sheriff's deputy, says she was inspired to do these tours in part to honor her own ancestors.
My folks have been here since 1828, when Francis Wells Epps, who's Thomas Jefferson's grandson, when he brought 120 slaves to Florida, to Tallahassee.
Copeland says she loves to explore and share this history, some that people may know and some that people would learn from her. But she says she does have homework for anyone who takes a part in any of these tours.
I want them to share it, tell the stories, pass it on, because that's how I know as much as I know. It's because the stories were passed on, and it cannot stop with my generation.
the Emancipation Proclamation never actually freed them. Different states got the news late, some years later even.
For Mal Jones, spoken word isn't just a performance, it's a purpose. He uses it to preserve Black history, uphold cultural traditions, and honor the legacy of his parents and those who paved the way.
I have people in my family that fought for the rights of Black people and never got to see this day come to fruition. My mission is to keep it going forever.
Rooted in a rich family legacy of arts and activism, Jones also channels hip-hop music to teach and uplift the next generation about history and culture.
By giving them a microphone and letting them use their voice to actually express themselves, like the griot, the West African tradition of oratory arts. Like, you remember everything. You write it down in a book.
Through rhyme and rhythm, Jones brings lessons and history to life. At Emancipation Day at Juneteenth events in Jacksonville, Jones takes the stage to remind the community that these moments are more than history.
But a lot of people don't still understand what the importance of Juneteenth is. What we're celebrating is the actual date that slaves discovered they were free, because, they hid that information from us for 2 years. This fire has got to burn for a long time. 2 years after slavery is a long time. Let's keep it going for 200 years after slavery.
With remembrance and purpose, he makes sure the meaning of Juneteenth lives on and the fight for freedom continues.
The story of Juneteenth carries on through history, cultural pride, and powerful celebrations. And as we move forward, a hope for equality and unity in our country.
By tracing the roots of our history within our local community, we fuel a future filled with hope and with progress.
I got freedom to stand, freedom to walk, freedom to love, and freedom to talk. I make the rules as I go, choose my destiny, I follow my dreams.